there's a lot of people here. That's pretty cool. You guys know I'm going to talk about white space for a whole hour. For all you know, I might just stand here and not say anything. And you'd be afraid to leave because it'd be really quiet. But you're still here. Are you guys high? I was thinking about this. We're at South by Southwest. This ballroom holds 800 people. There's like a pretty good chance somebody in here is high. That person is really paranoid right now. It's probably about 100% chance, actually. It's not me. I take my job more seriously than that. But it's great to be at South by Southwest presenting, which of course goes without saying. However, you know that really annoying time of year every July when people were trying to get you to vote for their South by Southwest panel? Well, that was me 2 years ago, and I wrote a blog post to try to get votes for my talk. And I didn't get a talk, actually, but I did get a book deal from the blog post. So I wrote this book called Design for Hackers, and I'm finally here presenting at South by Southwest, and I know there's a lot of you probably in the audience who helped make this happen, so thank you very much for that. It's very good to be here. And I want to make sure, since this is my first big, real South by Southwest appearance, I want to make sure that I have everything just right. My mom hired this camera crew. So, hi, Mom. She doesn't relate to my mom. I want to make sure I get all the elements of a good South by Southwest presentation in. So I have this checklist here. Hopefully you guys won't mind. So, for example, we've got first thing is party. Okay, talk about partying. I just asked you guys if you were high, so check. Good. Next up is promote. All right, so I told you about my book. So please buy my book. Good. Wait, let me take a peek at this last. Okay, well, we've got 2 out of 3. You know what they say about that. 2 out of 3 is pretty good. So we're off to a good start. The hashtag for this talk is SXWhite, which might be on one of these things up here. It's on every slide of the presentation. Feel free to use it because I'll give away a few books at the end to people who are using that hashtag. I want to start off with a story that I think will sound familiar to you. My first sort of realish job, I was an intern at an advertising firm, and I was designing this email newsletter. And so I made it your sort of standard early 2000s email newsletter design. I put a menu on the left-hand side, and then I had main content on the main part of the design. And I went and I showed it to the client very proudly, and the client said, "This has too much white space." Okay, so I went back and I made it 3 columns, and this time I really crammed everything in there. And I took it to the client, and the client said, "This doesn't have enough white space." And I felt like I was designing for Goldilocks. But this probably sounds familiar to some of you because everybody in this room, at some point in time, some point in their life, has been in a conversation, in a group, looking at a design. Somebody, maybe even you, or you, has said, "This has too much white space. This doesn't have enough white space." However, never in the history of the world has anybody ever looked at a design and said, "You know what I like about this design? The white space. The fonts are ugly, it's in Comic Sans. The colors make me want to puke, but the white space, blah!" Never ever happened before. So this was really strange to me, and I wanted to understand this a little bit better. So 10 years ago, I did what any reasonable person would do, and I grabbed a bottle of deodorant. Mitchum brand deodorant. You've might not have heard of it. It's kind of the Tab Cola of deodorants. And back then they had this tagline, "So effective you could skip a day." I thought it was kind of funny. I was really just looking for a little petri dish of information that I could use to experiment with white space and experiment with creating a hierarchy. Because really when it comes down to it, everything that you design is a lot like this bottle of deodorant, not necessarily the design of the bottle itself, but everything you design is a lot like this bottle of deodorant because there's information on it, and that information has a hierarchy to it. We have the name of the deodorant, Mitchum, we have our tagline, we have directions, though really who doesn't know how to use deodorants, but we have all sorts of information on here that needs to be expressed in different ways. And so just forget about HTML, forget about jQuery and CSS and all these things that you know about design. Everything that you design is a lot like this bottle of deodorant. So what did I do with the bottle of deodorant? Besides apply it to my underarms on a semi-daily basis? I took the information off of this bottle of deodorant and I conducted experiments in white space, a little bit like this one, just using all the same color, all the same font, and I just arranged things on the page to try to see how I could express the information and create a hierarchy. And so today, I'm going to present to you some of these findings. I've used them working at an architecture firm, at a couple of Silicon Valley startups, on weekend coding projects with friends. And so whether I've been putting together a quick CSS style sheet or putting a sign on the side of a granite building, this knowledge, this experimentation that I did has always paid off. So my presentation today is structured into a few different layers, if you will. You might be surprised to learn that when you're talking about white space, there's a little bit of theory involved. So I'll be talking about theory first. So if you are high, don't put your joint down just yet. But keep a cup of coffee around because we're going to get into more specific stuff during the practice portion, and then we'll have some examples. So, I think the Japanese have a word that describes what white space really is really well. And I say I think because there's no direct translation in English for this word. The word is ma. And at least according to Wikipedia, ma is the simultaneous awareness of form and non-form. So the simultaneous awareness of form and non-form. So if you think about the way that the form of a block of marble actually influences the form of whatever sculpture is taken from it. Or if you think about the way that the spaces between notes in a song heighten the notes themselves. Or if you think about the way that if I were to tell you to use white space, use enough white space, use just enough white space, use the right amount of white space, be far different than if I were to tell you that I have a dream that one day the white space in designs will be thought about as much as the rest. And I think the Gestalt theorists understood ma, or understood white space really well. You've probably seen this picture before. Do you see a vase or do you see two faces? And so everything we design has that relationship to it. Here's Flipboard, who their entire business is white space, just putting white space around the information that you're already going to read. But it's all really just a bunch of design elements. If you were to squint, everything would have different sort of weights to it, and there would be this space in between them. And that space, that white space, carries just as much information as those objects that you actually have in your design. So if you aren't thinking about the white space in your design, then you're ignoring at least half of your design. So, theory. I want to talk about the idea of texture. So we have these great things called letters that create words and communicate meaning, but there's a lot of meaning communicated by those letters themselves. Every font has a different sort of texture to it, and that's dictated by how much white space is around the forms that make up the font. So if you were to squint your eyes, something that is a bold font is going to have a darker appearance than something that has a lighter font. And this is just true across all different typefaces, and when you're designing, this is always an important thing that controls the visual relationship between things. And dominance. So just because one word is on the right-hand side, and we read from right to left, and it's darker, has a heavier visual weight, our eyes may be drawn to that a little bit more. Now, if these things switch positions, then maybe the lighter object is a little bit more dominant than it was before. And if it gets bigger, then it completely changes things. But of course, when you're designing, the things you're designing are a lot more complicated than this. You've got user photos and user information and metadata and titles and subtitles and all this information that you need to express and give a spirit. So I think it helps to think of this. There's this psychological phenomenon of chunking, which isn't necessarily used in interface design a lot, but I feel like they're kind of related, even though I'm not a neuroscientist and there hasn't been anything done to actually prove that they're totally related. But most of us, if we had to count all the dots on the screen, given enough time, we'd be able to do it. The way that we would do it is we would count a few dots, we would shift our focus of attention, we'd count a few more dots, we'd keep doing that until we had counted all the dots. But if you happen to have bilateral damage to your parietal lobe, which hopefully you don't, you won't be able to shift your attention around. So people who have that sort of damage, they can see or count like 2 or 3 objects at a time, and even infants can count like 2 or 3 objects at a time. So it sort of implies, it hasn't been proven, like I said, but it implies that there's sort of a different part of the brain that can count a few items just sort of pre-processing without shifting focus of attention. And if you look at really successful interfaces, you see this same sort of thing at work. Just like you see it in numbers like phone numbers or social security numbers, the way things are chunked up into 2 or 3, sometimes 4. You see this in interface design a lot. So the Twitter iPad app is a good example of this. They have this wonderful card metaphor. And there's always only a couple things that are really trying to grab your attention on the Twitter iPad app. So here we have our main timeline and our menu. And then as you dig deeper, notice that menu becomes smaller. And there's still just a few items really capturing your attention there. And as you dig really deep into a tweet, then it totally dominates your field of attention, and everything becomes secondary. And even if you dig down into individual tweets, which as a list they sort of read as one unit because they're so close together, as you start to dig down into an individual tweet, you see that it's really just a few different items that are grouped together by alignment and that have visual relationships with each other of some things being dominant over other things. And so as you're navigating through all this information, it's chunking it together for you so that you only have to process a few things at a time. Now, when you are making all these size changes and such, it's helpful to have some sort of guidance on what sizes to make things. So proportions are good to understand. So anything that has more than 2 dimensions to it is said to have a proportion. So this square is a 1-to-1 proportion, this other rectangle is a 2-to-1 proportion. And it's believed that some of these proportions are more attractive than others, that you could actually take people and have them look at these different squares or rectangle dimensions, and they would actually say that one is more attractive than the other. And probably the most fabled proportion, the most pretty interesting proportion, is the golden ratio, which is constructed like this. It has a proportional relationship of 1 to 1.618. And it's pretty interesting. It was used to determine the proportions of the Vitruvian Man. So supposedly the ideal human body is based upon the golden ratio. And then as follows, the architect, Le Corbusier, created a proportional system called modular, which was just a bunch of units of measurement based upon the Vitruvian Man, where you could use these units of measurement to determine how tall a wall is, or how large a door is, or the size of a doorknob. One of the more interesting things about this golden ratio is that you can subdivide it over and over again with a square, and if you draw quarter turns within these squares, you end up with this logarithmic spiral that is said to be found in nature, and that's used as an example to explain that this is supposedly a divine proportion. And so one of the more common examples of this is that of the Nautilus shell. The Nautilus shell, it obviously is constructed from a logarithmic spiral, so oftentimes this is put in juxtaposition with the golden ratio, and so therefore it's believed that the golden ratio is this magical proportion. Interestingly enough, you find that if you draw a golden ratio spiral over the Nautilus shell, it doesn't fit at all. It's not even close. Makes you wonder if anybody ever bothered to verify this claim. So what gives? This is supposed to be the golden ratio, not the fool's golden ratio. It turns out there are other interesting proportions in our world. So for example, if we took 3 guitar strings, all tuned to D, and we strummed the first one, you would hear a D note. Now, if we took another one of those guitar strings and made it 3/4 of its original length, we would get a G note, or the 4th note in the major scale. Now, if we made it 2/3 its original length, we would get an A note, which is the 5th note in the major scale. So this 1-4-5 chord progression is the basis of 12-bar blues. It's the basis of most pop music. There's a song called Twist and Shout by this band called the Beatles you guys might have heard of that is actually this exact same chord progression. So the point is there are other interesting proportions in this world. 2/3, 3/4, golden ratio are all proportions that through studies have been found to be more attractive than, say, a square. But it hasn't been found that the golden ratio is somehow superior to any of these. And this simplifies things a lot when you start working with proportions in your design. I'll be talking about that a little bit more in the practice section of the talk. But it's not a big surprise when you look at the devices that we designed for. So the MacBook Pro, pretty close to the golden ratio. The HD TV, not very close really, but sort of. And the iPhone is a 2-to-3 proportion, very interesting. And this presentation itself is a 3-4 proportion. 3-4 is an interesting proportion, I think, especially because if you took 2 squares, one 75% of the size of the original square, and put them next to each other, and started drawing quarter turns within those squares, and continued this pattern on until you had a logarithmic spiral, it would fit the Nautilus shell perfectly. I almost fell out of my Aeron chair when I discovered this. This is just a Nautilus shell from Wikipedia, by the way. It's not like I was sorting through a whole bunch of different Nautilus shells to find some freak mutant Nautilus shell that wasn't based upon the golden ratio. This is the real deal. So to close out the theory section, texture affects visual weight and affects dominance to an extent. The chunking helps your user navigate through all the information in your interface. Proportion, there's plenty of interesting proportions besides the golden ratio. There isn't one particular that is absolutely better than all the others. So, put down your joints, pick up your cup of coffee. It's time for practice. First, I want to talk about this word clean. I hear people talk about clean design a lot. It's usually a compliment, right? This design looks clean. It's a good thing. But I kind of wondered what was a clean design. So I asked people on Twitter, what's a site that has clean design? So here's some of the answers I got. Google's homepage. Okay. I think that's kind of cheating because there's just a search box on it pretty much. But yeah, okay, I get it. It's funny. About blank. All right, that's totally cheating. There's nothing on about blank. That's just when you open up the browser window and there's nothing there. So these are really clever answers. But I think they hint to the fact that people seem to feel like clean design just means that there's less stuff. But it's not really the case. In fact, something like the New York Times iPad app has tons of information on it, but most people would say it has a clean design. The thing is that minimalism or clean design or simplicity is much more than just a visual style. You have to really understand what it is you're trying to communicate and communicate that with precision. And I think one little philosophy that can help you do that is understanding that 1 + 1 = 3. A little petri dish for understanding this phenomenon, which is introduced by Edward Tufte, the information design guru, is tables. Pretty much every program that makes tables that look a lot like this. And at first it doesn't look like much of a problem. It's got these lines here that are supposedly here to help guide our eye from one piece of data on the table to the next. But 1 + 1 = 3. So the white space between these pieces of data is one thing. These lines is another. These lines are another. And when you bisect one of those pieces of white space, then you have 3 things. You have the white space on each side of the line, 2 things, and then you have the line itself. And you find that you could actually completely remove these lines and have a perfectly functional table. And it actually looks a little bit cleaner. Now, I did do some little things. I made some of the data italic to give it a different sort of feeling and spirit. But this actually works quite well. And it sounds really nitpicky, but we're improving our data ink ratio here. This is another Tufte concept. The idea that every little dot of ink or little pixel in our design is actually communicating something is really contributing to our design. Thinking like that over and over again is what leads to clean design in general. So let's see this at work on something a little bit more familiar. This is planet Earth from outer space. And if you were asked to draw this, you might draw something that looked a little bit like this. Again, doesn't look too bad. We've got a nice outline here for the edge of the Earth, and then we have our land filled in. Now, if you thought about how 1 + 1 = 3, you might come up with a clever idea of maybe making the ocean all colored in and leaving the land masses completely empty, and you notice that your eye just completes this circle, and you now have something that communicates a little bit more efficiently, and in fact can be seen better at smaller sizes, which is part of the reason why this is pretty much exactly the alerts icon on the Facebook mobile app. So this phenomenon of our brains being able to complete things is something that we take advantage of when we work with grids. And grids are really just imaginary lines that we line stuff up along to make everything look nice and crisp and organized. Some common grids that are used are like 4-column grid, 6 columns, 8 columns. You can break it up in different ways to create sections to put information. And notice when you're working with 4 columns or 6 columns or 8 columns, working with proportions such as 2/3 or 3/4 would be a lot easier. If something takes up 3 columns, then that's easily 3/4 of 3 out of 4 columns. But you don't always have to perfectly subdivide the composition. Just as an example, Twitter until recently was designed based upon the golden ratio. That little sidebar on the right was 61.8% approximately of the width of the timeline itself. So to construct a regular grid, though, just based off of 4 columns or 6 columns or 8 columns, you have your live area and you divide it with gutters so that things don't butt up against each other, just subdivide it equally. And then you have places to put elements, and you can span columns, and you have places to put things so everything looks nice and clean. And you don't always want to deal with building this sort of thing from scratch, so there are a number of different frameworks out there. CSS frameworks, 960JS is one example. I'm going to talk a lot about Twitter's Bootstrap today, because in my research and looking at a lot of these different frameworks, it's the best one that I've found. I'm going to talk a lot about some things that could be better when you're working with Bootstrap, but I don't want to sound like I'm knocking on it because it's a really good framework. A lot of the things are just the fact that you're working with a one-size-fits-all sort of solution. But it's important in general when you're working with grids to remember that the grid system is an aid, not a guarantee. That a lot of times people take it a little bit too literally, and that leads to some problems, which I'll illustrate in a little bit. So, some grid gotchas. Column soup. See this a lot. Something like Bootstrap is based off of a 12-column grid, by default anyway. And just because you have 12 columns doesn't mean that you need to use all 12 columns. It's again, because it's a one-size-fits-all sort of thing, people take those 12 columns and they get confused. So what happens is here we have a menu on the left-hand side, and we've got a hero splash thing on the right-hand side. We're off to a pretty good start. And then we can subdivide a little bit underneath the splash thing. All right, well, it's not like equal subdivisions, but it still works out okay. Everything's sort of balanced. It's not so bad. And then we do something like this, and it starts to get a little bit sloppy. And then we really lose our, really lose it, and then we have column soup. So some ways to maybe avoid this: when you make a global decision, such as saying like, this is our menu over here on the right-hand side, stick with that. Pretty much nothing should start intruding on that space underneath there until you cut it off with, say, a footer or something like that. And it helps if you're working with something like 12 columns to just pretend like you have 4 columns or pretend like you have 3 columns. Don't get too granular with it. And one gutter doesn't fit all. Again, these frameworks are one-size-fits-all solutions. So as a result, the gutters are all the same, which doesn't seem so bad at first. But notice, for example, like the gutter in between our splash area and our menu is the same width as the gutter that we have between our little bits of information underneath the splash, which starts to make it look kind of stale and doesn't necessarily express what we're really trying to say about our information. So for something like this, I'd suggest just making that gutter in between our menu and our main area just a little bit wider. So it starts to separate those main areas and really describe what you're trying to say about your information, that this is our menu over here and this is our main area. And then you have your general, bless you, your general gutter size for all the rest of the stuff. And also, it helps to trust your eyes. Grids are an aid, not a guarantee. So again, we have our layout here, and notice that the section entitled Death Threats, that line that it lines up along with also lines up with our splash area. And again, that's one of these things where it starts to look a little bit stale because we have this big padding around our headline and everything in our splash area. And so actually, if you just push things in a little bit to sort of make that information a little bit subdominant to our main splash area, then it starts to express our information a little bit better. So now we've gone from this, when we had the same gutter and we were taking the grid totally literally, to this. It's just very small details that really change the way that we're expressing our information. So typography. Working with typography, very important to clean design because most of what you're designing is typography. It helps to manage size. Working with proportions, you can manage size in a way that results in a much cleaner look. So here are what's so funny. Here are the H1 through H6s of Bootstrap, Twitter's Bootstrap. And they're all basically just different sizes from one another. Again, this is a problem with it being a one-size-fits-all solution, I think, because honestly, who really needs 6 levels of headers? It's kind of good that they're there, but generally, most of the time you're using 3, maybe 4, or something like that. And so it's when they start changing sizes and they start running out of scale changes to really make these things look different from one another. So if you add some restrictions to your size choices, you can make some size changes that are a little bit more expressive of the hierarchy that you're trying to create. One thing I like to do is create a varied scale, which is basically, I start with a very small size like 5, and I divide it by 0.75 or proportions such as that, and I start building a scale of type sizes. Because when you're working with type size, you can choose any size you want, and it just doesn't need to be that complicated. You have way more things to worry about. And so if you give yourself a restriction and say, these are the only sizes I'm going to work with, and they're in proportion with each other, then you start to get size changes that have a cleaner look to them and express our information better, and plus it makes your choices a lot simpler. You could also work with 2/3. So here's a scale based off of 2/3. And I use the one at the top there. I've got totally memorized. Anytime I'm picking a type size, it's a non-issue. So let's see this in action a little bit. Here is an H1 and H2 from Twitter's Bootstrap. Not a big size change there. Here it is if we use our varied scale, and actually I skipped a step there. So now we have a size change. It's looks a little bit more like that H2 is less important than the H1. Here, they're almost the same size. So working with those scale changes can help you have a cleaner looking design. Horizontal spacing with typography is something you can also manipulate a little bit to express things and change texture and change the visual relationships between different pieces of information. kerning. You've probably heard of this before. It's the spacing of the white space in between individual letters to balance things out. But this is something you can actually work with as a visual technique, especially with something like all caps. So if you space out some caps and they start to have a little bit more of a lighter texture to them, not something that you want to do so much with the lowercase letters because of these A-centers and D-centers that we work with, that we use to read those. Spacing out the lowercase letters, not exactly recommended, but it's something you can do with all caps. Now, don't make your body text all caps because that would be screaming, and you know that. But for stuff like metadata or little titles here and there, caps can really give information a different spirit and change the texture of it by manipulating the white space. So here's that in action. Here's an H1 and an H2. And if we just make that all caps, it has a completely different personality to it. A move that I see a lot is say a blog post title and the metadata underneath it. We have a nice scale change here, but if we make this metadata all caps, spread it out a little bit, we start to get something that expresses it, makes it look like metadata a little bit more. Vertical spacing in typography, managing the white space between lines of type vertically is also important in expressing the information. So here is an H3 in Bootstrap, Mitchum's solid protection formula. And does something look wrong with this? Look a little odd? There's an awful lot of white space between these lines of type. And I see this a lot in these frameworks. They're working with what's called line height here. So here is the font height of this particular font, and then the line height lives kind of outside of it. So when you have lines of type and you increase your line height, then that space in between those lines of type gets bigger, and that changes the texture of the overall block of text and everything. So the problem that a framework such as Bootstrap has with something like that H3 is that they work, a lot of them, with what's called a baseline grid. And all this is that they're always working with certain increments of measurement. So for example, Bootstrap uses a 9-pixel baseline grid. So everything's based in 9-pixel units whenever they're working with line height. So their H3 is 18 pixels tall, and they don't want to make their line height 18 pixels because that wouldn't be quite enough. So then they have to jump up to 27 pixels, and then they end up with way too much white space, way too loose of line height and leading. So just in general, I don't want to get into the subtleties of the baseline grid so much. They get used a lot in frameworks like this. They're great for really advanced typography, working with print, for example, or when you're trying to line things up across columns. But a lot of times you end up missing the trees for the forest, which is exactly what's happening here, I think. So if they were to just forget about it, here's a couple things that might make things look a little bit better. One, I really like to work with M's for some of these proportional measurements. And an M is a unit of measurement that used to be based off of the width of an uppercase M. But it's been standardized, so now it is equivalent to the font size of a particular font. So if your font size is 16 pixels, then 1M is 16 pixels. So for example, with that H3 that we're talking about, on Bootstrap, they're using 27 pixels. That's essentially 1.5 M's. Something a little bit more like 1.2 M's would be a little bit more appropriate for that header. And a range between like 1.1 and 1.3 for headers like this is a good range. I'm going to have a way to actually get these exact numbers if you don't get a chance to write them down later at the end of the talk. Now, working with body copy, something more like 1.2 to 1.5 ems is good. And you'll notice that really changes the texture of that block of text, and that's something that you can take advantage of sometimes when styling blocks of text and determining what sort of line height to use. Now, when you're creating space in between individual paragraphs, signaling a new paragraph, something like a margin bottom of 0.7 ems, 0.7 to 1 ems is good. That's enough to sort of signal like this is a new paragraph. That's a good amount of white space for it. And working with bullet points, you can start to have a lower line height. 1.25 ems is kind of a lot. You can go down to like 1.1 ems. And one thing that this does is that then when you add margin bottom to your bullets, something like 0.5 to 0.8 ems, now these lines of type are close enough to each other that they read as one bullet point, but then when you have that space in between them, then they start to read as individual units, to the point that if you wanted to, you could just completely remove the bullet points from them. They would still read as individual units. So, just to summarize the practice section, helps to think about data density when you're designing to have clean design. Grid system is a guide, not a guarantee, and working with a varied scale and can really help simplify your decision making. And then know all those typography spacing guidelines, which I'll have available at the end of the talk. So now some examples. I think there's probably no better example of Ma that we might be familiar with than the FedEx logo, which you might know, between the E and the X, there's an arrow. I'm waiting for gasps. But either everybody already knows that or they're just like, whatever. Or they're sleeping. Or they're high. It's not like totally in your face, but once you see it, you know it's there. It's appropriate to the logo. And it's pretty clever. And remember when I was talking about making that little gutter change between our main content area and our menu? The MCA Chicago website is a good example of that. Notice the gutter width over in like the main content area, and then notice the gutter width between the main content area and the menu, just a little bit wider. Expresses very subtly, this is our main content, this is our menu. And also notice this huge white space between our header information and everything underneath it, or the navigation and the logo and stuff. Some of you might have been doing some planning with Sketch.org here at South by Southwest. Actually, I was talking to Taylor McKnight, who's one of the founders, and he made it to an early version of this talk on my book tour here in Austin. And he said it changed the way that he designed Sketch.org, actually. So you look at the way it was before, they had a pretty heavy gray line around all of their schedule items. The time slots the times were pretty dominant. Then they had these subtle gray lines horizontally between time slots. But now you notice they just use white space between the time slots. Notice the difference between in the white space between the time slots versus the white space between the talks within a time slot, and then they have much more subtle times there. You might have noticed that the Google properties have been redesigned recently. Are they any good? No. They're fucking great. Hold on a second. Where's my pen? Oh. F-bomb. Good. successful South by Southwest appearance. No, but seriously, the Google properties look really nice. They're really communicating with a lot of efficiency. Here's Google Docs. Notice the way that look at this title and these menu items. It's just size changes. There's no visual elements there at all. It's just white space and alignment. Now, when you scroll over those menu items, there's a little bit there to signal that you can click on those things. But you've used this interface arrangement before. You're not stupid. You know that file, edit, whatever is something that you can click on. You don't need much more than that for affordance, versus before where they had a lot more extra stuff. Also, Gmail is looking a lot better, I think. Notice, for example, there's a vertical line along the edge of the email itself, and the title of the email is in just a little bit. So trust your eyes that the title of the email is in just a little bit, and then it lines up with the avatar for the person who's writing the email. Now, contrast that with before. The title of the email was just sort of lining up with this this weird outline that was around everything. So, that is everything you ever wanted to know about nothing. So, thank you for coming to my talk.